So for this afternoon session, we will focus on data planning, on collection and analysis. So it's important that even before we start doing a research, we should plan how we will gather our data, what kind of data we want to collect, how we will collect it, and why are we collecting it, and how will it answer the research questions that we hope to be answered by our research. And we should also have a plan to do the analysis. So once we have the data, how do we analyze it? So what are the things that needs to be taken note of? So why is it important to plan for data processing and analysis? So why is it important to plan for data processing and analysis? So I think the most obvious answer to the question is that if you don't plan your data processing analysis, you will have poor data quality. You will have data that will not really be useful in answering the research questions that you wanted to be answered. So the reason why we plan for data processing and we plan for data analysis is that we need to ensure that all the information that we really need have been collected and have been collected in a way that meets the standard criteria for data collection. So I have sat in some research presentations where the research presenters were asked questions about their data, and the problem was that they have a lot of data, but then the data that they were presenting did not really answer the key research questions that they needed to be answered. So an example would be if you wanted to collect data on teenage pregnancy, especially the perceptions on, let's say, teenagers, no, on the phenomenon of teenage pregnancy and how do they perceive that. So maybe it's a qualitative data process where you do key informant interviews or you do focus group discussions. And then part of your research question is the gender lens, for instance, what's the difference between teenage boys and teenage girls in terms of their perception on the phenomenon of teenage pregnancy and why it's happening. And then on your data collection, all the people that you were able to gather only during the research data collection were all female. So for the FGDs, you were not able to recruit male respondents. So teenage boys, no, in the study. And you will just say, oh, sir, because sir, it's hard to gather teenage boys and collect data from them, given this question. So that would be a big problem in terms of your data collection. Also, we want to ensure that we do not collect unnecessary data, which we will not analyze. So I think one of the major weakness, especially for us, no, students of research, is we want to collect so much data, so much demographic information, so much questions that we want our respondents to answer, but we don't really need them, but we collect them anyway. So we are hungry for data, but that's a problem because remember when you do research, when you do data collection in the field, data collection is expensive. It is expensive because it requires time, not only the part of the researcher to go to the field and collect data, but also on the part of the respondents, because the more questions that they need to answer, the more time that they will be spending with you during the data collection process. So it's important to make sure that if we collect data and we want to ask the questions, those questions really answer the objectives, no, or meet the objectives of our study, so that we will not be making our research expensive, time consuming, not only on the researchers, not only in the research team, but also on the community through which we go to for data collection. So it's make sure to remember those reason why we need to plan for our data processing and data analysis. So when you talk about data processing, what are you talking about? So data is any information that you might be able to gather in the field. So uh, it could be in terms of numbers, for example, the number of teenage pregnant uh, in the community, or it could be a description. It could be a demographic information, for instance, the socioeconomic status of the respondent. But for it to be useful, you need to, when you capture that data, when you collect that data, you need to transform that information into something that is that will allow you to analyze the relationship between the different variables that you're looking at in terms of your research objectives. So that's why you need to process the raw data that you collect and organize them in such a way that they will become information. So let me just use a pointer here. So this is the raw data that we collect in the research. Then you have a process where you organize that data, process that data into groups or clusters of information, and then you organize the data and present that as a meaningful information. For instance, when you talk about teenage pregnancy, you want to present the information that teenage pregnant teenagers who get pregnant tend to come from families who are single parent families. So you have that relationship between two variables and present that as a useful information that you can present to other people who are interested in understanding the research that you're trying to look at. So this is data processing. You have raw data, then you have to organize the data. And then finally, you have to present that data that data in the form of information to others who will understand now what happened in your research and what information you got from your research. So we have different types of data from our studies. We could collect data from using questionnaires. So one of the more common approach to research will be using survey questionnaires. In many of my studies, I usually do surveys because I really want to collect primary data from the field, from the respondents themselves. But you can also collect secondary data. So, for example, you can collect data from case reports, case records, from patient records in the rural health clinics, in the outpatient departments, or even in the hospital itself, in the inpatient wards. So you could take a look at patient charts, etc. So those are data that you can collect. Different types of data from key informant interviews. It could be from observation of interaction in a social setting. So whatever phenomenon that you want to investigate, you need to collect data from setting that you want the data to come from. So it could be a hospital, it could be a community, it could be a laboratory facility, etc. Now this data needs to be processed so that they need to be transformed in such a way that they could be analyzed. And most of the today, we don't really do manual data analysis so much because we have a lot of technology that are available now, even not only limited to quantitative data. We now have qualitative data software as well. So you have in vivo, for instance, that allows you to do data analysis using transcripts of records, transcripts of interviews, transcript of focus group discussions, and even articles, articles or journals, as long as they are in written form, that can be analyzed by the software. So Quantitative, of course, you're familiar with Excel, you're familiar with SPSS. You also have Microsoft Access as well. And you can also have a BP Info, which is a free software that you can use from the CDC. But in the Canvas website, I encourage you to take a look at R Statistics, which is also an open source software that is the current standard for many research institutions in the world. So when you talk about open source software, it means it is not proprietary. It's not owned by a company or by an institution. It is collectively developed by the researchers all over the world who do the coding, and they can use it, critique it, they can improve upon it, and that's why uh, many of the research all over the world now are done using this approach, no, open source software, because then it is an open data. People can see what's happening and how it is programmed, and they can utilize the best practices of other researchers all over the world as well. So our statistics is one of the best open source software right now that you can use. Not, I think, not only for quantitative data analysis. I think they also now are going into qualitative data as well, but I have not tried it yet. So our data from our study needs to be processed into chunks of information that can be analyzed by our softwares like Excel or like NVivo. Now, there are some issues that we need to consider when we want to run our data analysis, and we want to process our data. First is we want to ensure that our data is reliable. It is it will be able to answer the questions that we want them to be answered. So, for instance, one of the things that you will find when you do your when you do your actual thesis writing and when you research, for example, when you're collecting data from thousands of respondents, for instance, because you do a study all over the province, for instance, you want to collect data from maybe 500 to 700 households, and then because there's so many people that needs to be interviewed, so many households, you need the help of what we call them field surveyors or field enumerators. So there are several people that you can ask help from, because if you have a large research, you need people on the ground to do the actual survey. And sometimes the way they collect data can be manual, like handwritten. So sometimes the handwriting is not legible. You don't understand what the 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 data that was put in the questionnaire, for instance. You cannot decipher or you cannot decode it. So one of the key things that you need to consider, especially if you have a large survey, is to ensure that the quality of data will not be affected by human errors or human factors. So that is why many of the survey questionnaires you might see, they simplify their questionnaires, like you could just put a tick or a check in the box, or if you need to write something, sometimes they avoid allowing surveyors to write down the answers, because that tends to put in human factors. So sometimes the handwriting might not be uh, legible. And even just for instance, I have some research data where the name of the respondent was obviously male, like Pedro, and then in the gender or sex box, it was ticked as female. So you need to check for those discrepancy in the data. So there could be some of those issues. So you need to put in place those kind of controls. Also coding, where you need to transfer the raw data into an organized set of tables. So you need like an Excel sheet, Excel file where you will put your data in a spreadsheet. So the respondents and how they answered the questionnaires. So you need to code for each of the responses. So you need to have a clear coding plan for that. And you need to have the ordering of the data should be clear as well. And of course, you need to understand how you want to process your data. Well, how will you run your quantitative data? How will you run your qualitative data? And finally, how you will do the analysis. So let's take a look at audit and control of data quality. So some of the things that researchers do, so lalo na kung malaking research na ginagawa nyo, but I think for in your case, since this is just starting your young researchers, you're not really expected to run big researches. This is just good to know. For example, you train your data collectors. If, for example, if you want to use BHWs or you want to use barangay tanods or barangay volunteers for data collection, that's okay. You can go ahead and do that, but you need to train them. You should let them run through the data collection tool with you so that let them practice collecting the data using a dummy respondent. So you could be the dummy respondent and then check if they know how to do the data collection properly and if there are any issues that you might run with. You could also ensure that there will be validity and the way that the data is recorded will not be prone to problems. So for instance, it's easier to just spell out the choices rather than allowing people to give answers freely, because that makes it more difficult to record the answers. And as I mentioned earlier, always check for consistency. If the name is male and then the sex is female, then you have to go back to the data and see where the problem is. So as I mentioned earlier, there are different types of data collection methods that you can use. You could, in public health, we can use medical records. You can use questionnaires. You can do interviews, surveys. So your interviews and surveys are very common among students. So they could be designed either to be structured, semi-structured, and in-depth. So I think you are familiar with this already, but structured means that the questions are fixed. The interviewer will not have any opportunity to ask other questions because the questionnaire is fixed. For semi-structured, there will be like an opportunity for the interviewer to go deeper and based on the answers of the respondent, they could probe, they could allow the respondent to explain. So that's semi-structured. Well, in-depth really, you have a free-flowing conversation rather than having a set of questions that you want to be answered. So of course, the mode will be different. You could have a face-to-face interview. It could also be via telephone interview. So because of the pandemic, sometimes some researchers need to forego face-to-face data collection. They need to collect data using telephones or using emails or using electronic format, for example, emails or social media posts, etc. So of course, when you design your questionnaires, you make sure that when you ask the questions that you want to be answered, that the questions can be comprehended, can be understood easily by the respondents. I found this very difficult because in the community, especially if you do not share the language that they have, for example, your Tagalog, and then you go to the Waray speaking region, there are difficulty in terms of translating certain concepts. So it's important really to make sure that the questionnaire have been designed in such a way that they are worded easily understood by the respondents, and the information that is being required of them does not need them to think so hard. First, what did you eat 2 weeks ago? That's kind of difficult to answer. So the questions that you want to be answered should not be difficult to recall. So it should be something that's easy to recall. And there should be a link between the question and the answer that was given. And of course, there should be the communication of response as well. How will they respond? Will they respond by answering yes or no? Will they respond by uh, explaining or by telling a story? So you need to put that into your mind when you design your questionnaire. Also important as well that we want to minimize, as I mentioned earlier, we want to minimize the burden on our respondents, that they, when they answer the questions that we are asking them, that it will take them 4 hours to finish the questionnaire. So make sure that the burden, especially in terms of the cognitive burden, yung or the mental resources, no, yung hindi sila masyadong mahihirapan to understand, to respond to the questions that you're asking. So you need to consider the channel of question representation. It can be verbal or auditory. It can be oral, can be visual as well. So just make sure that you will use the appropriate approach, no? So for example, one of our studies, instead of asking them orally, we ask them to point to, for example, a pain scale. I'm sure you're familiar with the pain scale. 1 to 10. There's an equivalent of that in terms of the picture, the pain. So smiley face to a grimacing face. So it will be easier for ibisan, even if they're not that literate or intelligent or well educated, they can point. For example, if you want to let them describe their emotional state or what they're feeling, whether the smiley face or the grimacing face will best describe their feelings. It can be visual as well. So it can be done that way. So if you think your respondents will have difficulty in understanding or answering the questions that you're asking. So the demand for literacy and visual self-administration methods should always be taken into consideration, because if the respondent did not understand or doesn't have the cognitive ability to answer the question, of course, the data itself that you get from them will be questionable. So yun ang gusto nating ma-avoid. Also, of course, we don't want to burden our respondents. So only use basic words using the language that they are familiar with. So the most burdensome, but also the easiest for researchers, but the most burdensome for the respondents are the visual and written methods of self-administration. Sila yung sumasagot, binabasa na, tas English pa, no? English, tapos complicated pa yung terms para sila nag-exam. So talagang it's the most burdensome way to collect data. So we need to avoid that approach. So this is just explanation of the structured and semi-structured questionnaire. So structured questionnaire involves the use of fixed questions, while the semi-structured interview, mayroong fixed questions, but you are flexible enough to probe your respondents. So the advantage of the structured questionnaire is the ability to collect unambiguous and easy to count answers. So madaling ma-analyze yung data, mas mabilis ma-collect yung data, and mas matipid because you are able to interview a lot more people in a shorter span of time. Yung disadvantage naman is pag pre-coded yung responses, baka hindi naman talaga siya nagre-reflect doon sa reality ng respondent. So they are forced not to choose inappropriate pre-coded answers that might not fully represent their view. So yun lang din yung problema sa structured interview. So mabilis siya, mura siya, convenient sa atin, but the respondents might be forced to answer the way the questionnaires are phrased. So ang assumption pa rin doon is naiintindihan din ng lahat ng respondents the same way yung question. So this is the best method for obtaining factual data, for example, family size, employment history. pero hindi siya ganun maganda when it comes to collecting information about attitudes, behavior, and social processes. So pag structured interview, hindi siya useful for attitudes, surveys, behaviors, and social process. So just take that into mind. Also, one of the problems with data is the source of bias. It's possible that the interviewer, the one doing the interview, can bias the study. Also, kasi minsan prime ng nag-interview yung respondent. So mayroon tinatawag na recall bias and framing. So the way the question is framed, ikaw ba ay malandi, parang ganun. So ikaw ba ay mahilig sa makipag boyfriend, girlfriend? So that can be a way of framing questions that might be biasing the interview. So there is what we call potential social desirability bias, where the respondent, because this is a public, this is like a public conversation, so they might not really tell what they actually feel because they want to present positive image, no? So that can be one of the issues with research. So we need to take that into consideration when you're designing your research. Meron ding mga questions that are done through, uso pa ito noon, parang hindi ko lang alam kung applicable ngayon, yung mga postal surveys or questionnaires, yung pinapadala by mail. Ewan ko ba kung may sumasagot pa sa ganun. Or the equivalent probably will be an email. So mas mabilis siya and can cover a large number of population, but they are less generally reliable than face-to-face interviews. So yung difference ng face-to-face interviews sa telephone interview has something to do with the fact na mas kayang mag-probe. Baro ka kasi doon sa face-to-face interview, you can have other sources of information like in facial expression, yung pause. Meaningful kasi siya kasi para siyang conversation. So mas detailed yung nakukuha na information sa face-to-face kaysa doon sa telephone interview or through electronic means. Pero of course, mas cheaper yung telephone interview because it does not involve traveling and other resources that you need to do when you want to do face-to-face interview. The problem is pag meron kang non-response, yung hindi sumasagot, it can bias your data. So pag pumunta ka doon sa data analysis, yung mga nag-response sa'yo are yung mga tao lang na favorable, yung kanilang perceptions, for example, about teenage pregnancy, pero yung mga hindi favorable, hindi sumasagot. So that can be a source of bias as well in your findings. So you need to consider that in your research analysis. So yung tinatawag natin na response rate are of course the number of responses that you get from all of the possible eligible respondents that you wanted to include in the study. So they can be calculated from the number of eligible respondents successfully included in the study as a percentage of the total eligible studies. There is no agreed universal standard for the acceptable minimum response, but generally, it is accepted that if you fall below 60% response rate, ibig sabihin medyo hindi maganda, hindi optimal yung response rate. So, parang rule of thumb is that you are targeting for a response rate of 75% and above. So you want to have people responding to you 75% of the time in your study. So many of the things that you might do to improve your response rate will be cover letters, advance letter, incentives, pwede kang bigay ng konting compensation. Hindi naman pera, probably could be in the form of face mask or alcohol, or use translations and interpreters sa mga tao na kaya makipag-usap sa kanila. Of course, take note of the appearance of the interviewer, etc. And also, if you want to do callbacks, for example, pag wala dyan or hindi available, you say, pwede kami bumalik some other time when the respondents are available as well. So when you talk about item non-response, ito naman yung, so iba pa siya sa response rate, no? From the point of view of the number of respondents that you are getting. Yung item non-response is, for example, yung isang question about in your survey, for instance, about sexual practices. So you're talking about teenage pregnancy. So you might have a non-response to particular questions. So inadequate responses to questions are 3 times more common on postal questionnaires at interview. Kasi doon sa interview, people can probe, no? Or can repeat the question. So hindi madaling mag-avoid yung mga respondents. So lalo-lalo dun sa mga mahahabang questionnaires, mas madali talaga silang mag-avoid, and they don't have the pressure to respond. So that's why most of them, pag nahaba na sila o ayaw nila sagutin, hindi nila sinasagot. No, so how do you handle non-response? So pag hindi sinagot yung mga tanong, in research, when you do your data analysis, you will consider the items that are missing, that have not been answered, as missing at random. Missing at random. Mayroon kasing implication yan. So ibig sabihin nun, hindi systematic yung bias. Hindi dahil mayroong something underlying that influences the non-response. Pag missing at random, ibig sabihin there is no systematic reason why people are not answering the questions. So the most common method is to assign the missing item. So for example, pag nag-analyze na kayo ng data, tas marami kayong missing doon sa question, sa mapapansin nyo, pag pinatakbo nyo yan sa SPSS or sa Excel, mag-error yan kasi may mga missing data. So they will ask you, what will you do with the missing data? Because they cannot compute the average, the mean, the median, for instance. So what is the most common approach is to take the average value of the completed items in order to be included, no? Kasi otherwise tatanggalin mo yung respondent doon sa total number of respondents that you will analyze. E paano kung out of 100 respondents, 50 yung mayroong missing data? So 50 na agad na respondents yung nawala sa'yo. So that's a problem. So one of the approach that they might want to use is to do this. You just replace the missing number with the average value of all the people who responded on that item. So that's one of the techniques. And another more complicated but more statistically robust, mas malakas in terms of analysis, will be what you call imputation, statistical imputation techniques. So in your higher research, probably when you do your postgraduate studies, you will hear more about imputation techniques. It's where you can estimate the most probable response of the respondent who did not answer the item that you asked, based on the answers of the previous, based on the answers on the other items, and based also on the answers of the other people who responded to the items. So that's what you call the imputation technique, and it's as higher statistics. Natutunan ko lang yan when I was doing my PhD already as well. So going back to our questionnaire design, we need to follow the rule of simplicity so that we will be able to collect the data that we need. Make sure that only the data that you need in your study should be collected. So you should plan that you follow or base your research design, your questionnaire design, based on the appropriate theoretical and conceptual framework. So for example, you're talking about attitudes and perceptions on teenage pregnancy. So you should have a framework that already exists in literature. So meron yan, I'm sure. For example, you have a theory of reasoned action or your theory of planned behavior. So merong iba-ibang theory. So depende kung anong gusto mong gamitin na conceptual framework. Then you need to make sure that based on the framework, you'll be able to get the data that will reflect the variables of interest in your framework. Diba? So, huwag kang mag-collect ng data na hindi doon kasama doon sa framework na gagamitin mo on the analysis of your research. So, you need to also pre-test the instrument. So, you need to make sure that it is piloted first. So, for example, you want to survey adolescents. So, you need to have it tested among adolescents themselves, no? Maybe about 12 people dun sa population na gusto mong matanong, no, in your questionings. So, in terms of your layout as well, so mamaya pag-usapan natin yung layout, but it is important that you need to take a look at the question numbering, the ordering, and also the cover letter as well, so that it can be used properly by the enumerators or the ones that are doing the interviews. So there are rules for open and closed questions. So if you have like a closed question, so it's answerable by yes or no. So that's a closed question. Pag sinabing open question, it's a question that is answerable, not answerable by yes or no. It needs to be explained. No, it's like a why question or describe question. So there are rules by which you can design your question. All right, so there are also what we call question items. You have batteries and scales. So minsan we just borrow, you don't need to design your own questionnaires or your own scales. So ako, for instance, when in my research, I'm interested in depression, anxiety, and stress. I'm also interested in insomnia due to post-traumatic experiences, for example, disasters, after typhoons or after major calamities. So you can use existing questionnaires. So one question that I use commonly to look at depression is the DES 21, the 21 item depression, anxiety, stress scale. You can also use the patient health questionnaire, 9-item patient health questionnaire. You can also use the WHO Kessler-6 instrument. So there are different instruments that you can use, different scales that measure depression, that measures any health variable that you want to measure. For example, anxiety or attitudes, for instance. There are measures of attitudes, so you can take a look at it and use them as well. So, and then you can come up with scores that will describe the phenomenon that you want to study. So, for example, you want to know how many in the community can be diagnosed as clinically depressed. So you can use, for instance, the PHQ-9, and there's a scoring system where you can say that according to the PHQ-9 scale, the 9-item scale, you can say that this person is high probability of moderate depression, severe depression, or mild depression, or they are not depressed. So it depends on the instrument itself. So there are a lot of instruments that you can use. In fact, I would encourage you to use standardized instruments for your research. Do not invent your own questionnaires to measure variables that already have standardized instruments available as well. We can just translate them and validate the translation. So for example, attitude measurement scale, you can, the most commonly used scale will be your Thornton scale or Likert scale. So Thornton scale is just agree, disagree, no? The question, there are statements and then you can answer agree or disagree. but it's more complex than the Likert scale because the Likert scale have like a range of numbers. For example, 7, 1 agree, then 7 disagree. Strongly agree for 1, then strongly disagree for 7, and then you can put your choices in between. No? For example, kung medyo in between ka, you can put 5. But for Thornstone scale, it's only agree or disagree. Wala nang. But it's more complex to analyze. So now what we commonly use for attitude measurement is your Likert scale. Because in contrast to Thornstone's method, there's no assumption of equal intervals between the numbers. So for example, from 1 to 7, strongly agree, strongly disagree. Hindi mo sinasabi na the distance between 1 and 2 is the same as the distance between 6 and 7. Walang ganong assumption yung Likert scale. So just put that into mind when you are planning your research instruments. So you also have, as I mentioned earlier, other forms of Likert scale, hindi lang numbers, pwede rin visual analog, yung smiley faces, pwede rin numeric scale. So make sure that when you write your instruments, you word them simply, it's readable, avoid leading questions, avoid loaded questions, aspire for balance, and just be guided that the way you ask your question can influence the answer as well, lalo na doon sa mga open-ended questions. Kaya be careful in framing your questions, and make sure also that the appropriate response choices are there in the questionnaire itself. So if you want to have specific answers, then ask specific questions, and make sure that if you have a complex questions, you can only do that in the context of a more, let's say, face-to-face setting. No? Pag kailangan i-explain, kailangan elucidate, do not ask complex questions in short survey kaysa hindi siya appropriate as well. So those are some of the important elements now when you are planning your data collection tool, you are designing your instrument. So whether it's a qualitative interview guide or a quantitative survey questionnaire, make sure that you make sure that you avoid the problems associated with inappropriate instruments, especially in the design as well. So I want to have time for us to have some interaction with regards to your research proposal this afternoon. So it's already 2:32. So gawin na lang natin is I have uploaded a video of a previous lecture I've had with the previous batch on further discussing data coding and analysis. So just take a look at that video. And since we don't have enough number of weeks anymore for you to actually, in the previous batches, I actually asked them to do dummy tables, no? Kasi mas maganda talaga na when you plan your data collection instrument, you already plan the tables, no? Kasi kung clear na sa'yo kung ano yung data na gusto mong lumabas doon sa research mo, you already have dummy tables, table 1, demographics, table 2, correlation, table 3, variables of interest that you want to take a look at. Then, makikita mo yung dummy table mo. When you design your questionnaires, you will make sure that all of the data that you want answered, that you want to have complete data in your dummy tables, you have to put that in the questionnaire as well. And if you think there's a lot of question in the questionnaires that cannot be put in the dummy table, then do not include that anymore because it might just lengthen your survey question and make it more expensive, make it more burdensome to the respondents themselves. So I will stop the recording.